All right, so I'm going to introduce you to the idea of, I've been talking about fields in my past videos, and now we're going to differentiate what fields and properties are. And this is pretty much the same concept we've been working on before, except I erased a lot of the other data just so I can focus in on this particular topic. So what I've done here is I'm creating I have a constructor that is receiving two values. When you create a student, you have to at least give me their first name, and you have to give me a student ID. And so I'm sending over a super secret student ID number of 5555. This all looks familiar. We've been doing it. There's not a problem here. When the student is initiated, we initiate the value of first name to that value that was received in our constructor, and we're setting the secret student ID into this string SID that we receive here as a local variable as student ID. All right, so far so good. But is it really? Okay, here is where I'm getting a little worried. Now remember that my class, student class, is available to anybody in the world that wants to utilize my blueprint for creating a student. And we did that because this is all public, right? So if I did a student1 .sid, and let's say midstream accidentally I now have the ability to change student ID to ABCD. Well, student ID is pretty unique to every student, and it's not something that usually changes in the course of their history at school, for example. So this would be a bad design, because we don't want to, as the designer of this class, we don't want to give our users the ability to randomly change whenever they feel like it, that student ID, unless we want control over it. And that's kind of the point here. So we need to take away this ability here. All right, so in order to do that, let's just look at this one field here. Now, again, field names are usually start with lowercase. And in this case, I'm going to make this private. In other words, private then says that this variable name, this variable, this field, is available only within the student class. Anything that's using this class outside of this particular piece of code, for example, right here, you can see that I've got a red squiggling line now where I didn't have it a second ago. And if I put my mouse over it, it's letting me know that student SID is inaccessible due to its protection level. In other words, I'm trying to get control over your ability to change this string whenever you feel like it. So when I first create the student, because it's part of my constructor, student ID will get initialized at the time that it was created. So okay, so it's private. How can I then, outside of the class, how in my student app can I ever have access to the student ID? Isn't that kind of the point? I do need to be able to see it. All right, so we're going to create what are called properties for our fields. And here's how those work. All right, so I'm going to create public because I want this available outside of my class, outside of my student class. We're going to create a public, let's see, it's a string. In other words, I'm going to create a property for this SID. And hopefully this will make sense as I go along. Properties are usually Pascal case versions of our variable. So here I was camel case, where I started off this variable name with a lower s. I'm going to replicate that name except with a capital S. So otherwise, that's all the same. Okay. And we're going to use what we call getters and setters, if you're familiar with that term. And here's how that works. All right, so we're going to type in the word get, open and close parentheses. And then I'm also going to put a set, open and close parentheses. And the idea behind a get is it gives whoever users of our class, we're giving them access to the value of our SID. In other words, I can see I've got a little red squiggly line, and it's wanting us to return a value. So get is get the value that's currently in the field represented by this property. So if let's say that, I'll give you examples, so hopefully this will all make sense as we go. Return, oops, gotta spell it right. Return SID. Return whatever is in this privately held vault, if you will, okay? And then set this would give us the ability, if we wanted to give our users the ability to change data midstream of their code. Because it's private, they can't do it through little SID, so we're giving them access to a public property that will do that for us. So we're getting control over what goes into that variable. So set, I'm going to change the value to a reserved word called value. And what that means, I'll explain that as we go here. So let's look back at our example. So we've got a getter that receives the value and a setter that's somehow going to change the value. And so let's look back here. So I no longer have access to SID, but it says that I have access to capital SID. So in other words, my property then, SID, is valid because I've made a public property that is really attached to my private variable that I have now given access to. Here, I guess I'm using the setter, aren't I? So I'm saying this ABCD, because I'm trying to set the value, is going to call the setter. This keyword value is going to receive whatever I'm trying to set it to. In other words, this value is going to receive ABCD and then assign it to SID. Okay? Conversely then, if I wanted to get the value, right line, if I want to print out whatever is in that value, I can't print out little SID, that's not valid, but I can print out, I need to do student 1, don't I? Student 1. So little SID is not available because it's private, but because I have a getter that's returning the value, I can get it from capital SID. So that should work. So that all looks good, and I should be able to compile and run. Let's see what comes out. So we should be getting, initially 555 got set to the ID, and then we changed it to ABCD, and we should then print out ABCD. So let's see if that works. And it did in fact print that out. Okay, so didn't this just break the rule that you just told us? And that rule is that I don't want to give you the ability to set this value. Wasn't that the whole point? Well, it sure was. So what if we did not give them the option of a setter, for example? Now, if I run this code, I'm guessing it's going to fail. Let's see. So debug, start without debugging, and you can see that I got a build error. Because of exactly that fact, it's letting me know that I don't have the ability to change that because there is no setter that's available for my property. So properties then give us the ability to control what happens to our SIDs. An example where, and it might not be a great example here, but an example where you could also do something like maybe if this was a bank account or something, if it was a withdrawal, I might only want to, maybe I'd set up a condition where the balance, if the balance is less than 0, then you can't make a withdrawal, and so therefore I won't set the initial value if something along those lines. So the point is that because I have control over, I now have, as the designer of this class, I have control over these fields by creating properties. If these are public, I have no control over that. The user can change or do whatever they want with that particular, with the value there. But by changing that into properties and assigning it to the SID, now I have the ability to either, maybe I don't want to return a value, so I'll get rid of the get. Or maybe in the set, I want to make sure that the balance is equal to something, or I want to make sure that something's not negative, or I want to make sure that what was sent over wasn't blank, or whatever. But the point is, by having getters and setters, as we call them here, I now have control over, let me put this back to, has to return SID, and then set is setting SID equal to the special value. Now I have control over these variables. And usually what you'll have is these fields are usually, you'll find, are private, unless for some reason you want to make them public. And then we set appropriate properties that we can then give to our users. And through these properties, we have control over those values, or what goes in or gets returned from these variables. So it kind of locks it down. So why does this one public? I don't know where I sent that to private, but there we go. So typically, this is what you're going to see, is that our fields are private, but we create properties that allow the users of our class to have access or limited access or controlled access or no access at all to our private variables.